This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again the famous Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Thank you, sir.
Before we start, maybe I should just make another announcement that I'm.
Could this be it? Could this be it?
Despite the presidential, shall we say, difficulties in getting a new president in there, I'm holding myself back.
And this is the year of chaos in the Republican Party.
I know.
Right
or it's really quite just external observers. It's both distressing and amusing.
Oh, well.
Well, as we've talked about many things in our conversations. Recently, President Obama has visited Cuba. There's an effort underway to start relationships back with Cuba, which is a pretty doctrinaire communist state. And it might be an interesting thing just to discuss what exactly is communism and why that system failed or seemed to have failed. Maybe we could start off with just the great triumph that I can recollect when the Berlin Wall came down, the whole Soviet Union cracked up. It was really an extraordinary triumph for American-style Western capitalist democracy, was it not?
It was indeed, and my wife, Carol, who is the true Russian specialist, pointed out at the time that when the Soviet Union collapsed, it collapsed in exactly the manner that she would have expected and predicted. It just did so a lot sooner than she or anyone thought would happen.
Well, why do you think it collapsed? I mean, maybe we can discuss that. Why did the Soviet Union implode?
Well, essentially, we outspent them. That what they had was not a pure communist system as Karl Marx or even V.I. Lenin would have imagined it to be, and it just was a thing of a very weak economy and very poorly managed. And of course, it was coming at the end of the Reagan years when Reagan had shown resolve by the massive military buildup that we were not going to be cowed by them. And I think Mikhail Gorbachev just realized that the game was up. The wheels were coming off, and in the face of a United States that had that kind of resolve, there was only one outcome.
Well, so in a way, there was these two great world systems in conflict with one another. And the idea was the winner of this conflict was going to win by military force. There's going to be the most powerful, nation bloc would subdue the other one, the armies would march in. And it didn't seem, if I could say it this way, that the workers' paradise in the Soviet Union attracted many supporters.
Yes.
So if you compared the two systems, could say for instance, East Germany and West Berlin.
Yes.
I mean, the people would just say, well, look, here's the way this system works, and here's the way that system works, and I don't want to be in this system.
Yes. Well, the workers' paradise, the workers' utopia, is really it's the final stage of communism predicted by people such as Marx and Engels. And I think the thing to remember when you're studying communism is that stage was never reached. I mean, even the Soviets would say that stage was never reached. The basic idea of Marx is that with the Industrial Revolution developing and the gap between the rich and the poor widening, Marx had claimed, and this is in the mid-1800s, had claimed to discover this immutable historical truth, that at some point the large class of oppressed poor would spontaneously rise up and drive the rich bourgeoisie out of power and create a new state, a new dictatorship of the workers. And the main goal of this dictatorship would be to use the word of your choice, educate, indoctrinate, brainwash all of humanity into understanding that the great evil of humanity is the concept of private property, the statement, this is mine, because it is over property that all of the miseries and wars of the world have been fought. So at some point, it may be 1,000 years, it may be 1,000 generations, when we get to the point that a generation would be born without even understanding the concept of private property. At that point, everything is held in common. It's not my watch, it's not your watch, it is our watch. And there would be no need to fight over it since we hold everything in common. And that's actually where the phrase communism comes from. And this is what the dictatorship of the proletariat is working towards, and of course has never come anywhere close to achieving.
Well, I mean, we can't put North Korea out as an example. I mean,
I'm not sure if that's truly communist. It's
well, I mean,
Stalinist.
Well,
yes,
actually, I mean, I'm going to sort of bounce the basketball
Yes,
a little
yes.
bit on that. We've often had discussions about the relationship between equality and liberty. So if you're getting into this workers' paradise, I mean, it's impossible in this set of circumstances, if you could say it that way, to have the freedom, if you want to talk about it that way, that property gives.
Yes.
So there would always be a dependence on the system. There could never be a true independence or relationship. You could not. You couldn't have any sort of identity outside that of the state.
Yes.
And it required, if I could say it this way, the system required, if I can recollect the little dogma here, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. Yes, and so the idea is that people would just spontaneously grant other people the fruits of their labor without any kind of problems attached to this,
Yes,
and would be happy in that set of circumstances.
Yes.
And the people that had needs would never counterfeit needs. They would only say, "I'd like an extra hamburger," if they truly needed that extra hamburger, and they would never try and just ride the system.
Yes.
And it seems a bit, just to speak about this, the problem with this, it's contrary to human nature, is it not? I mean, this is just a system.
It's naive. It is the alligator brain is selfish by nature. I mean, isn't the biological process the process of taking something that is not you and converting it into something that is? I mean, the process of eating or breathing. And so that would at least seem to give you some sort of title to your own body. I mean, we hear this from feminism, a woman's right to control her own body. So just an extension of that. The first thing a child does when it cries, when it's born, is cry. I'm cold, I'm hungry, see to my needs, I don't care about you. So you're essentially trying to educate someone out of and away from human nature.
Well, and just to continue with this, actually it's sort of an Animal Farm sort of story here.
Yes.
So really what it seems that it's impossible, if I can say it this way. I hope I'm not any of the communists in the audience are not offended by anything I'm talking about here, but maybe a few of you out
Perhaps
there.
some faculty members.
There might be some academic
Yes.
out there that's blundered into watching the show. But the takeaway message is that this is just a very naive arrangement that occurred in special sets of circumstances, you could say the 19th and 20th century, where we could look at the root causes of communism, where the system was a corrupt, excessive. There were lots of societal problems that existed, and this totalitarian solution was offered up. And in doing that, millions of people were killed, and this new sort of ruler class appeared, who live have the big limousines. They live in big houses, and their kids get the benefit of their higher station.
Yes.
And so this system, I mean, what I'm doing is I think the idea is that, at least in some circles, the idea is being bounced around a little bit. This is really cool. I mean, this communist system is really neat. And if we could only get back to this, the problem that occurred, the reason it didn't work was that we really didn't give it a chance. That all we need to do here is just expunge property rights and in some ways disregard our whole notion of what's right and wrong, and have this higher reality that would make for this human paradiso.
Well, this is why Marxism, in its pure form, is a religious faith, because you can always say, we need to try it again, the conditions were not right, that you can neither prove nor disprove the idea of this Garden of Eden that we're going to, except to keep on experimenting until we get it. And of course, if we never get it, then we never get it.
And I submit we cannot get it because of the way the brain is constructed.
Yes.
We have this Neolithic brain that has its good parts and its bad parts, and it has an altruistic arranged part to it. but it has a very aggressive seeking desire for power, wealth, whatever. It's very difficult to expunge that from human nature.
Yes,
and these efforts to do that have inevitably ended in some horrible tragedies.
Inevitably.
I'm thinking about Cambodia, Pol Pot there,
Yes.
the millions of people that were killed.
The Bolshevik Revolution, of course.
And the story that appeared, I mean, what I'm trying to do is I'm actually pushing a little bit that there could be some revision of history afoot now, as we hear a lot of conversation about the penalties of inequality and how great it would be to expunge inequality. That would be really good. There's too much inequality, and so maybe
Yes.
there's something to be said for
Yes.
communist Cuba.
Well, yes, exactly. And I want to back up a little bit before we go down that road. I mean, in all fairness to Marx, the gap between the rich and the poor and the conditions in which they lived in the mid-1800s and late 1800s these things were pretty horrible. It's just that and the goal of Marx is noble. It's just that it cannot be attained. The John Lennon song "Imagine," it really is a communist utopian vision. I think we would all love a world as described by John Lennon. The problem is no one has ever come up with a feasible way of getting there. That's why it's entitled "Imagine."
And so what we have to do is we have to, I guess, recognize our evil natures.
Yes.
And the problem that occurs is when people try and overcome neurochemistry and they try and impose a rigid dogma
Yes.
on human affairs. And in doing that, in order to enforce that dogma, they have to destroy every person and every thought that's contrary to that.
Yes.
And they do it with censorship, do they not? I mean, the free interchange of ideas is very restricted.
Oh, absolutely. I think if you used the term liberty, at least in a Marxist-Leninist setting, you would have to be using it in the sense of liberty from the indoctrination you have had at the hands of the bourgeoisie. And so we, the people's dictatorship, are here to free you from that kind of thinking and to indoctrinate you in the proper kind of thinking of true equality for everyone.
So there's a lot of, to go back to George Orwell, a little bit about double speak and the way that
Yes.
words work.
Yes.
And so just to discuss this a little bit, the words, I think people would say in 1950, this is what a communist was. This is in 1940, this is what a communist was. But if you actually ask the question now, what is a communist? Well, firstly, they're not any around anymore, are they?
Hey, except on college faculty.
Well, I know, but
Marxists.
well, that's right.
So,
They don't use that word. And
Yes.
in general, a lot of the ideas have morphed into other, there's another sort of loose description of people that travel that road, who in earlier years would have been called fellow travelers or
yes, yes.
whatever.
Or pinkos. Would be
Pinkos, yeah, that's right.
pinkos.
The ideas. And so just in understanding what I'm trying to get into a little bit is there's a limit to going to the left in regards to diminishing property rights. There's a limit to that. And if you really try and go to an extreme as exists in Cuba or North Korea, then you run into terrible, terrible evil. If I
Yes.
phrase it that way.
Yes, and I do think that the word communist today has a lot of historical baggage to it. That when an American, especially one who lived through the Cold War like you did or like I did, that it doesn't really necessarily mean Marx. It's more of a Stalinist view of a dictatorial kind of society. So it's not really seen of as an economic thing, but as political oppression. And you certainly have that in Cuba. You certainly have that in North Korea. But North Korea, as I said earlier, I don't think I would describe as a communist system. It's more of a Stalinist system. And as a matter of fact, McGeorge Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor to John F. Kennedy and to Lyndon B. Johnson, wrote, I believe, his senior thesis, and it was entitled, "Was Lenin a Marxist?"
Yes.
And obviously, Marx said that this would be a spontaneous uprising. It wasn't in Russia. Lenin had to force it.
Yes.
So yes, it comes with a lot of baggage. So what are we dealing with today in Cuba? Is I think the
Well,
question.
what I'm getting at a little bit is a lot of the ideas that are touted about are they have a bad history attached to them in the sense of excess. Not that the idea itself is, you could say, well, we want equal pay for equal work, we want no poverty, we want all these things. And the idea is, well, okay, those are good things, but what price do you have to pay to obtain that? And so I think that it's discussion about Cuba now is I think it was interesting to me to just sort of listen to some of the interchange between President Obama and Raul Castro, and discussing how great things were in Cuba. Well, they've got, let's see, the equal pay for equal work. Women and men have exactly the same amount of money, which is a joke, isn't it? The state says, well, I'm going to give you, who cares how much money the state gives you? They could give you a quarter, 10 cents. It's just a worthless chit.
Yes,
really.
And equal means equally impoverished in a lot of
But it wouldn't really matter. I mean, so the state says, well, here's $5, $2, $1. It's just a de minimis. The number is so de minimis. And so irrelevant to your contribution that it just doesn't matter. So I think that's one thing that's touted. The other thing is, well, we have our health care is free. Well, obviously,
how good is that health care?
What's that?
How good is that?
Well, that's a good point. It's and the other question is, what is free? I mean, is anything free? So what the state is doing is taking resources that maybe you could have, I don't know what, bought a new car as opposed to the cars they have there, and you could have done something quite good with the money, but the state has put these cumbersome health arrangement together. Finally, one other thing that amuses me a little bit is that they were discussing how, in fact, President Obama made reference to how great the Cuban healthcare system was, and they were sending physicians and nurses overseas to help the poor in other places. But in reality, what is happening is the state are taking those people and sending them somewhere else and taking money for their services to fund the coffers of the government and their repressive regime. So if the doc who works hard or the nurse, maybe they're going to get $10 from the state, and Venezuela will pay the Cubans $2,000 for their service as well. It's amusing to me the American president touted that as that's pretty good. They did that. I mean, I find that amusing.
And going back to this idea of free, once again, if we are living in the perfect communist society, there's no need for a state anymore. There's no need for dictatorship. This is our watch. But also, not only is it our watch, what you do in the OR is our labor. So it just gets away from the labor theory of value at all. We all essentially work, if you will, for free in the sense of I'm as entitled to what you're doing as you are. We come back to the idea of naive.
Now, I think we've bashed the Communist Manifesto around a fair
amount. We've been pretty rough today.
Whatever, we're just bashing Cuba around a little bit. But maybe we can make this point. There's the sense of balance that's needed. And you made a reference, I guess you could say, to the excesses of capitalism. And we've talked about income redistribution earlier. We've discussed that. So it is true enough that if you have a capitalist system where property becomes, it accrues to one person, and then the value of the property is there, and so monopolistic arrangements could take place. You could imagine a system in an arch capitalist world where it's all property and power goes into the hands of a very few people, and then in doing that, they don't appropriately make use of the property, and those people that do not possess property or find themselves in terrible circumstances as sort of
modern serfdom.
Yeah, that's right. They're sort of proto serfs, really. I mean, and so we have a sort of a fine line there, don't we, as to how to make a just society. How do we configure our world that we'd say, well, it's not perfect, but the emotions that could do us in, or at least we respond to them. Any comments about that?
Well, I think the difference is that whereas anyone coming out of the Judeo-Christian mainstream Western tradition would say that we are selfish. We have to be selfish to some degree. And I think if you talk about the alligator brain, as we were talking about at the beginning of the half hour, there's always going to be a degree of selfishness there. That is something that Marxist theory denies or says that we can work our way out of. That's the naive part. But just because there is some selfishness, because we admit that there is some selfishness, doesn't mean that we have to be selfish or will be selfish all the time. That the individual human, unless he's a psychopath or a sociopath, will feel empathy for someone who is worse off than he is, will give to charity, will do something to try somehow to improve the condition of his community or of his fellow man. So I think that is the saving grace of a capitalist society if it's working properly. Will there be people in this society who are too selfish? Yes, there will be. But will there be others who will take up a heavier burden? One would hope so.
Yes, and we can get in. We have a little brain discussion here. We can get into that a little bit. So there is the something called the rhinoencephalon, if you want to use the more technical word. It's the more basic part of the human brain. We four-layered cortex, the particular structure of the brain, our human brain, that matches that. You correctly said, a reptile or an alligator. Yes. Very similar. And then on top of that, we have this neopalladium, six-layered neocortex that's mathematical logic reside. And in there, we also have an altruistic arrangement. So if you look at humans, they always, besides being violent and mean to each other, they also have this redeeming grace, to use a biblical word or a theological word. They have some grace about them intrinsically there, where they want to assuage the sick, the needy. Yes. And that's part of our condition.
I have two questions about that part of the brain. Number one, in evolutionary terms, isn't it much newer? Therefore the much weaker, theoretically?
I don't know if I would say weaker. And that's the human condition. I mean, yes. the dark angel and the light angel, or whatever, the struggle, yes. The human, going back and forth, and everyone in their own lives has that dilemma about yes. good and evil, and nations do too. Yes. And I guess just being rational about what humans are capable of is an important thing for politicians and political philosophers. I guess the story about the America as it goes forward, what's going to be the correct, I guess, how can we parse out the capitalist system with some of its excesses? Mm-hmm. What do we do about that?
Yes,
and one thing I think you sort of mentioned peripherally is the idea that if you accumulate goods, the idea is that you're going to recycle them as charity, which is a particular American kind of thing. If you compare it with Western Europe, the idea is that if the state takes care of everything, I mean, that people don't feel the need to have that connection. And it's particularly true in Western Europe, where there's sort of I guess you'd call them social democracies yes. in some place, and there's very little charity.
Yes.
But the amount of giving that occurs here in capitalist America is much greater.
And it's very interesting because a lot of times there's, of course, this campaign season we're seeing the inevitable discussion of which of the candidates is the more Christian or the truer Christian, and they're yes. slamming each other. I do think that the idea of having the state as the intermediary and taking from you and then giving to others through a welfare program or Medicare program, that's not really, I don't think that's really part of the Christian tradition. Because, and Bill Clinton himself yes. is the one who said while he was president, think of taxes as your contribution. Well, the yes. difference in a tax and a contribution is if I decide I'm not going to pay a tax, I have that money garnished by the government or I'm thrown in jail. It's not a contribution. So the true Judeo-Christian, you by your own volition part with this money. You give it away yourself. You don't have it taken from you by an intermediary.
Yes.
So, and I think that's what you're talking about, the charitable impulse.
Well, I mean, what I guess I'm getting at is family, as we get near end of our conversation, is the sense of balance that's necessary. Yes. And how do we get that balance? And I think it's many times pointed out. Well, look how great it is in Norway, or Scandinavia. It's just wonderful in Denmark, and they have a sort of a socialist country. And why don't we have a socialist country? And why don't we do that? Which it doesn't have the extremes of Cuba, and in many ways, the election that's coming up, I think. many people on the left would say the country needs to go to some of these utopian social democracies. Why can't we be like Canada? We'll let the state do everything. We have high taxes, and everything will just be really good. And the question is, how does that political model comport with our exceptionalist country? We have a very exceptionalist kind of place here. I mean, how does that work?
Well, you have to look at fundamental differences, and these can be ethnic differences, they can be historical differences, they can be environmental differences between these social democracies and what we've got. You have to turn your back on the concept of rugged individualism, on the frontier thesis, the idea of self-reliance, and these things, perhaps unlike the reptile brain or the alligator brain, we could be bred out of these in time. We certainly have much more of a social welfare network now than we had 100 years ago. But how far could you take that before you run into the realities of evolution and biology?
Well, I don't want to get too complicated. Yeah. It's a long journey to discuss this issue. But my opinion is that in some ways, if you're in a socialist country and you accept this state arrangement, you in some ways accept serfdom, if I can phrase it that way. Yes. The idea is that you have a relationship with the state. The state's going to look after you in whatever state of where your place is in the world. The state's just going to make sure it's a comfortable niche. Yes. And getting out of that niche is going to be extremely difficult. And if you did that, you still could not. One of the biggest incentives to do something is to pass something along to your children. Yes. And if the state prevents that from happening, you sort of get yourself locked into this kind of arrangement. And not to overkill this, but if you looked at whoever the big dogs are in Scandinavia, they often are the people that have noble titles attached to their name. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of this. How can I phrase it? It's the antipathy of the American deal, where yes. everybody's got a chance. And there's a cycle about going up and down in the world. Yes. It makes for a very invigorating special place.
Yes, it does. Can it be maintained?
That is a good question. Well, okay, Bucky, I think we've had a good interchange tonight, and we'll have some more talks about these important issues. So
Indeed,
thank you for
being
here. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.